So we'll have time to just introduce our subject, and but that's okay. One thing that you'll figure out about me, and when it comes to class, is I would rather take the time to glean more from a passage than to try to hurry up and get through, and so that's. We'll take whatever time we need with it, but I want to start a study of the book of James this morning for our Sunday morning class. And so if you want to turn to James chapter 1, of course, that's where we'll be beginning. And this is not a verse-by-verse study of James. This is going through the chapters and picking out some passages and gleaning from those as we look at some things that we can learn from James. James is a very practical book. The sermon this morning is about building a life, and James is very much about that. James is a practical book about how to live our life and live it for God. So as we begin James chapter 1, our text for the lesson this morning is verses 2 through 4. Would someone like to read James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 for us? All right. So James begins, and James introduces himself as a bondservant of God, the Lord Jesus Christ, commonly believed to be the brother of Jesus. James, the brother of Jesus. James he begins this with talking about the trials that we face in life and the different things that we have to face as Christians. The truth of the matter is, bad things are going to happen. The difference is, what really matters is how I respond to those. What my perspective in life is about those things that happen to me in life. None of us are going to live a life where we don't face bad things. That's part of life. It's part of living. We just really need to accept that. So the question is, when those things happen, what's my perspective on it and how do I approach it? And that determines whether or not I am a victim or a victor. I would suggest to you that you never have to be a victim. As a matter of fact, I would go so far as to say, make up your mind right now that you will never be a victim, that you will always be the victor. Now, I'm not talking about competition, winning competitions. I'm talking about life. Because whether one is a victim or a victor is a state of their mind. It's a mentality. It's what I decide to be. Somebody said, well, no, now, the bad things happen to people and people are in bad circumstances. I get that. I'm not denying that at all. I believe that is true. My heart goes out to them. But you get to choose how you will respond to those bad things. You don't get to choose always what happens to you. You get to choose how you will respond to it. You get to choose whether it will tear you down or you will build yourself from it. That you will allow God, see what God has to give you and to bless you through that hardship. Now, notice what James says here. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, which is read. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into bad stuff, various trials. King James Version says divers temptations. But the temptations here is not being tempted to sin. He doesn't say count that joy. All right. Various trials, and the New King James Version is a good translation of that helps us to understand it. Count it all joy when you fall into, and that idea of falling into means that things happen that are beyond your control. when you fall into various trials. How in the world am I supposed to count it joy when bad things happen? Because if I approach those various trials with the right mindset, and if I'm looking for it, there is a blessing to be found. There is always a blessing to be found. Always. That's a pretty bold statement, I know. I'm sure that there are people in the audience right now who have suffered some pretty bad things in your life. Some catastrophic events. And just so you know that I'm not speaking as someone who hasn't been there, I'll share with you one that's happened to me. October 24th, 1994. I had been working as a youth minister in Tuscumbia, Alabama. I was a security officer at Regency Square Mall, and I was going to school at International Bible College, which is now Heritage Christian University. In my spare time, I try to get some sleep. But I wasn't getting to preach as a youth minister. There was an associate minister, and I never got the opportunity to preach, and I had a burning desire to preach, so I decided to resign as youth minister, resign as a security officer, and I would go back to Lawrence County, Tennessee, where my daddy had his construction business, laying brick and block. And so I did. And I went back to work for Daddy. I had been trained in masonry, laying brick, block, finishing concrete, and went back to doing that with the intent of finding some churches in Lawrence County where I knew them, they knew me, and I knew I'd have the opportunity to fill and preach until I could find a congregation to preach. We were working on a church building that had a big addition, and there was 2 levels of classrooms that were built against a multipurpose gymnasium style room, very tall, about like this auditorium. And I was maybe a little taller, but anyway, I was up on the 2nd level. We had just finished laying the block of the partition wall, and I was joining the mortar in the partition wall, and I had my back to the opening where the concrete there was no wall in it, just opened into the gymnasium, and I took a step backwards too far, and I flipped and fell head first on the concrete below. And I remember that fall. I remember grasping for a piece of conduit that was hanging out of the wall, trying to break my fall. Next thing I remembered was paramedics cutting my jeans off. The next thing I remembered was being put in an ambulance after they had taken me to the emergency room at Murray Regional in Columbia. And they couldn't get life flight fast enough to take me to Vanderbilt, so they put me in an ambulance. And I remember as I got into the ambulance, a brother in Christ who was working as a paramedic in another ambulance saw me, and he switched ambulances and got in there with me. He was a singer. He liked to go to singings, lead singing like myself. And I asked him, I said, Wade, you going to lead me a song? I really don't remember much after that. For probably the next 2 or 3 weeks, I really don't have an idea of the time that went by. I had suffered multiple skull fractures, multiple facial fractures, crushed both wrists, shattered my right arm, and broke my left arm in several places. I've got a bone graft in this wrist with a screw right there. I do have a screw loose. And I suffered severe brain damage. And they didn't know if I would ever come out of that or not. Some would say I haven't. But I've managed. And I didn't know people. I didn't know my best friend I'd known all my life. Didn't know people, hallucinated and went through all of that. They ended up having to cut my head open, which if you ever notice, I've got a little dent in my head here. That's where they cut my head open to patch up a hole in my skull. Yes, I do have a hole in my head. And to patch that up from the inside to stop the spinal fluid from draining. And eventually, I managed to get my mental faculties for the most part back, but in the process, I'm completely deaf in my left ear. A skull fracture severed a nerve to that ear. I haven't smelled anything since that day. A facial fracture severed the nerve to my nose. And I live with pain every day of my life. It's part of life. I share that with you because of this. If I had it to do over again, if I could go back to October the 24th and just pay attention to where I put my foot, I wouldn't. There is no way in this world I'd go back and change that. I have been so blessed as a result of what I went through in that. I told my sister, who I would not be in the same house with, I love you for the first time in 10 years. And we have a great relationship with it now, but we didn't then. And I meant it, and I still mean it. I love her with all my heart. But it took facing death to find the ability to love her like I needed to love her. At the time, Stacy and I, who had dated for several years, we were not dating. We had tried for the third time to break up. It's hard to break up when you love each other, but we had religious differences. She was not a member of the Lord's church at the time. We couldn't see it working out, so we were trying to move on with our life. A moment when I came to at Vanderbilt Hospital, I had enough presence of mind to say, somebody call Stacy. I want her here. So my best friend, who I didn't recognize, and my dad both called Stacy. She came from Alabama and came up to Nashville and was there with me through that process. It brought us back together. And as a result, we ended up getting to live life together. You think I would trade that? If you go in my office, people who go in my office, first thing they say is, wow, you have a lot of eagles. There's a reason for that. There were times that I would get frustrated. I would start to get discouraged because I could do nothing for myself. I couldn't bathe myself. I couldn't feed myself. I couldn't brush my own teeth. I couldn't do anything for myself. I was totally helpless. I had to call my nephews to put on my socks and help me put on my clothes, little boys. I had to depend on somebody else to bathe me, to feed me, to brush my teeth for a while, and then I got to where I could handle a fork. My hands were paralyzed. They were like this. They were paralyzed. I couldn't move them. I learned humility. I was too proud. I believed that I was totally independent, that I was a self-made man. I didn't need anybody. Left home when I was 19, never asked for a thing. I was very proud of that. Too proud of it. My prayer on a regular basis is that the Lord would keep me humble. And I sure needed some humility, and I learned it. And when I would start to get frustrated, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31 would get me through. They that wait on the Lord shall renew their strength, shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not faint. And so there's the song, Teach Me, Lord, to Wait. I expect you know the song. And I would start singing, Teach me, Lord, to wait. And I would sing it over and over again until I got through that moment. That's why I collect eagles today. That's why the eagle is so important to me, because it reminds me of what God did for me at that time. And I developed a relationship with God that was deeper than I had ever experienced before. There was another gentleman who had an accident at the same site. And he fell just about the same spot, but he didn't fall as far as I did, and his injuries were not as severe as mine, but they were very severe. And I think he fell off of a ladder or a forklift. And he went through depression. And so somebody told me, after I had gotten where I could be back out on my own, I went to that same job site. It lasted for quite a while. And somebody said, hey, Paul said that if you ever showed up, he wanted to talk to you. So I went and found Hoss. I said, somebody said you wanted to talk to me. He said, yeah. He said, I just got to know, how did you go through all of that without going through depression? I said, Isaiah 40:31. That's it. Turned it over to God. Tried to find what God had in store for me to learn and to develop and to find in that process. There is no way I would go back and undo October 24th, 1994. I gained too much from it. And so I share that with you so that when I say we need to listen to James and find the blessings in our trials, I'm not somebody saying that who hasn't been there. Some of you have experienced worse things than I experienced already, and some of you will. I've not lost a spouse or a child. I've not gone through some of the grief that some of you have gone through, and that's far worse than what I've experienced. But when we face these trials, we face them with the mentality of, I will not be the victim, I will be the victor. I will come through this stronger. I will come through this better. I will turn it over to God, and I will see what God has to show me as He refines me through fire in this. And you know that's how gold is refined, right? You heat it up, you torment it, you torture it until it's pure. And the same thing with steel, to strengthen it. The same thing that happens to an athlete or a bodybuilder when they're training. You push those muscles to the limit and you tear them down so that you can build them back up stronger. That's how you build muscle. That's also how you build spirit. That's how you build spiritual strength. And so you go through those times and you look for the growth opportunities, and you look for the blessing, and you look for when you have gone through the furnace and you've come out, what you will have gained from it. You focus on that. And there is always a blessing to be had. If nothing else, if you go through it with God and it makes you closer to God, it draws you closer to God, and it teaches you to depend on Him, that's a blessing within itself, right? So James says, my brethren, and I love that affection. And he's somebody who knows what he's talking about too. He says, my brethren, count it all joy. Count it joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But and then he goes on, he says, but patience, when it has its perfect work, in other words, when it has come to fruition, it develops then that perfection, that completion in us in which we are lacking nothing. Next time, I'm going to look at some other passages. I'm going to come back to this, and we'll look at some other passages that deal with how that we can be sacrifices to God. and what that means, what it means to be a sacrifice to God, and how that when we do that, when we turn our life over to Him, and we allow Him to work in our life, how it affects us and how it strengthens us, how that Jesus was a perfect sacrifice for us. And when we look at Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, which teaches us to not be conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of our minds so that we could be a spiritual sacrifice to God. And look at how our life experiences can shape and mold us and help us to have a life of sacrifice and teach us to be a sacrifice to God. So, if you would, read the first chapter of James, but focus especially on verses 2 through 4. Look at how it teaches us to strive toward perfection and to build endurance in our lives. And we'll take all of those, explore some other passages of Scripture, and flesh that out next time. And when we've got hopefully a little more time. But this morning I just wanted to introduce that lesson to us. Thank you. I believe we're going to have a prayer for the meal. It's very unusual for me to actually quit on time. I was trying to quit on time. I thought we were ready. Michael and